lot of Mustang owners like, no way, I'm not getting the new Mustang, S197 for life. One question we see all the time is which Mustang's better, and that's an impossible question to answer. But a lot of times it comes down to which generation's better, and two they're always compared, the S550 and the S197. And the owners of both cars will argue back and forth for hours over which one's better. S197 guys will be like solid axle for life, while the S550 guys just sit there grinning in their fancy interiors. So which one is better? Well, that's a question only you, the actual driver of the car, can answer. What we're gonna do today is compare the two of them and take them for a ride. So in this corner we have the S197 Mustang. We talk about S197s, we're talking about Mustangs made from 2005 through 2014. Now for comparison's sake, we're gonna pick what we feel is one of the best examples of the S197, and that is the 2013 through 2014 Mustang GT. And not to say there's anything wrong with the other versions, but it's what we have handy, and again, it was the last car of the generation. Now for 2013 and 2014, you had a couple different choices. You had your V6 Mustang, your Mustang GT. In 2013, you had your Boss 302, and then for 13 and 14, you had the top dog, the GT500. Now again, we're gonna focus on the Mustang GT, but we'll touch on the GT500 as well. So as far as the styling goes, the 13 through 14 GT featured a GT500 style front nose, had that classic Mustang long hood short deck, also with that classic fastback style. Now you had your LED headlights in the front, and one of the best looking Mustang taillights in the back, and a pair of dual exhaust tips going out the back. Now as far as the interior was way better than the SN95, but still very plasticky inside. You had a large tack and large speedometer, decent steering wheel, and finally a remote mount shifter for the manual, which made it much easier to reach the shifter and have a much nicer center console. Now as far as the suspension goes, you had a strut style front suspension and a solid axle in the rear with a 3-link style suspension setup. Now the 3-link had 2 lower control arms, 1 upper, and a panhard bar. This made for excellent ride quality, but also worked well on the track. Whether drag racing, autocross, or road course, the 3-link worked really well, with the exception of some of the issues of having a solid axle rear suspension. Now when it came to drivetrain, you had the Gen 1 Coyote, which is a legendary engine. Now in this configuration, it's 420 horsepower, 390 pound-feet of torque, and your choice of an MT82 6-speed manual or a 6R80 automatic. Now in stock form, the manuals were a little bit quicker, but a lot of these cars running in the mid-12s, and some of them with tires like our car behind us actually running even bottom 12s in stock form, making it for a very good performance package. Now the top line for 13 through 14 was the GT500 with a 5.8 liter supercharged engine, 662 horsepower, and 631 pound-feet of torque, backed by a 6-speed manual transmission. Now these cars would run 3.5 seconds 0 to 60, the quarter mile in mid-11s, and topped out at over 200 miles an hour. The best thing about the GT500 though, a few small modifications and a little traction, and these were easy mid-10 second cars. It's an engine that loved modification, and at the time was the most powerful Mustang ever built. Now on average, your S197 Mustang is gonna weigh around 3,500 pounds. Obviously there's different packages that'll be different weights, but on average you're around that 3,500 pound range. These are gonna be about 188 inches long, 74 inches wide, and around 55.5 inches tall. Now in this corner, we have the S550 Mustang. The S550 showed up on the scene in 2015 and should be available through the 2023 model year when it's replaced by the S650. Now over the years, you had your choice of the Mustang V6, the Mustang EcoBoost, the Mustang GT, the GT350, and the GT500. Now again, like we said, we're gonna focus on what we feel is the best model year, and that's gonna be the 18 and up Mustang GT. And where the S550 was very different than the S197 was the styling. It was a very European influence, and while it had a lot of Mustang DNA, the styling was a lot different for a lot of Mustang enthusiasts. You had very narrow headlights that shaped around the front of the bumper. You still had that long hood short deck fastback look, but again, this car was over 1.5 inches wider than the previous model and almost 1 inch lower, giving it a completely different look than the outgoing Mustang. And one of the areas the S550 really shines over the S197 is the interior. Because of the change in the shape, the interior is much roomier. It's also a lot more user-friendly, and while there's still a lot of plastic in there, the surfaces are a lot softer, everything's easily reachable, and overall the interior just has a nicer feel than the S197. Now when it comes to suspension, they still had that strut style front suspension, but the big news for the S550 was the independent rear suspension. Going to an IRS style suspension made for a car that handled much better, rode much better, and overall was a much better performing car. Now while the factory setup had some issues on the drag strip, on the autocross and road course, that IRS suspension really excelled. When it came to engines, now you also had the Gen 3 Coyote. 460 horsepower and 420 pound-feet of torque made it the most powerful engine yet. And the big news for 2018 was the A10, the 10R80 automatic. Now you still had your 6-speed manual, but that 10-speed teamed up with that Gen 3 Coyote made for an awesome performance car, with these cars running into the 11s bone stock, which was amazing for a Mustang GT. Now, despite being almost 200 pounds heavier on average, the S550 Mustangs definitely had the performance advantage over the S197s, and then you had the GT500. The 2020 GT500 with 760 horsepower was the most powerful Mustang ever built. Now, a lot of owners were very upset that there was no true manual transmission, but the DCT Trans works amazingly well. Now, it's a dual clutch transmission, which works like a manual, but does not have a clutch pedal, but that allows that engine to absolutely shine. Now, a GT500 can run 0 to 60 in less than 3.4 seconds and run the quarter mile in mid-10s with decent traction. Again, that makes it the most powerful and also the fastest Mustang ever built. So while stats and numbers and information are all well and good, what's it like to actually drive an S197 versus an S550? Now, is it extra weight noticeable? Can you really tell the difference in the rear suspension? Well, we're gonna start by taking our S197 for a ride, followed by our S550. Now, the S197 we're using here is Gotta Have a Race. It's our former 2013 Mustang GT race car. Now, this car has lived a couple different lives. Right now, it's got a full exhaust, long tube headers, full Petter suspension underneath it. We put the Boss wheels and tires on it. So it's a nice street car these days. It's not a, not a race car anymore. This car with some modifications ran as quick as 11.0s with it. And it's always been a fast car, but it was a fairly a base model when we ordered it. 373 gears, manual transmission, Recaro seats, and that was pretty much it. But this is obviously a very familiar car for me to drive. I put a lot of miles over this car over the years. And the first thing you notice with the S197 though, especially if you've driven an S550, is the interior. I mean, it's all textured plastic, and the dash and dash pad, they are softer. The doors though, the center console, even the steering wheel, they all kind of have that same sort of plastic texture to them. Not necessarily attractive. It definitely feels dated by today's standards. But again, it's a familiar place. If you're used to the S197, you definitely, you're right at home with this interior. Like I said, these have a remote mounted shifter, which was a huge upgrade from the SN95. Makes the transmission, the shifter is kind of right here. It's very, very comfortable to drive. And again, the interior is roomy. I mean, compared to the SN, it definitely feels a little bigger inside. The cluster's further back, which is kind of nice. Again, it is a little dated by today's standards, but the thing that people love about the S197 is how well they respond to modifications. I mean, that solid axle rear suspension, this was the last of the muscle car Mustangs, so to speak. I mean, it was great for the drag strip, mild modifications. These cars did really, really well, and they still ride nice. I mean, the solid axle with the 3-link and the front suspension, these cars ride great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're very, very comfortable. I mean, handling-wise, this one's got aftermarket suspension on it, grips the road really, really well. Where you notice a difference with the IRS versus the solid axle is in corners. It's easier to upset that solid axle when you're going through a corner, especially if you hit a bump or it's off camber or something like that. That's where you really notice it, and over bumps. It doesn't take the bumps quite as smooth. But again, the solid axle's been in the Mustang since the beginning, and it still does a great job. It does what it's supposed to. Now, this car is still on its stock MT82 transmission. They did make some changes in 2018. They changed the gear ratios and a couple other small things inside, but the transmissions basically stayed the same through the current Mustangs, with the exception of like the Shelbys and stuff that got the Tremix in them. But love it or hate it, the MT82 is not a bad transmission. With good supporting mods, they hold up really, really well. I mean, we race this car a lot. This has a Barton shifter, and it has a blowfish bracket on it, and this transmission's never been out of the car. Well, I'm sorry, for the clutch replacement, but we've never damaged it. The transmission has been solid through its whole life, and still shifts great today. You also feel kind of more upright on the S197. You feel like you're more taller. I mean, you're only talking an inch difference in height, but it is noticeable. I mean, you do really kind of feel that difference. But we're gonna go through some corners up here that have some bumps in them, and that's when you can kind of feel the solid axle. It gets a little bit, unsettled in certain corners. I just remember they repaved this road, so those bumps aren't there anymore. But like I said, overall, this is a very familiar, very comfortable interior. The materials could be nicer. Yeah, on corners like that, you can feel, you know, the solid axle. If you have a comparison, you can tell, you know, the rear is planted, but it's not the same as the IRS. I mean, you're getting that lean, you do a little bit of traction, and it can get a little unsettled over certain bumps. But now let's take this car back to the shop, and we'll jump in the S550. So now the S550, you know, we're in Cheese Whiz. This is our long-term project car here at CJ's. We use it for all kinds of things. This has a full pedal suspension on it. Currently, it actually has a factory exhaust because we've changed it about a couple dozen times. Factory brakes, you know, minor upgrades here and there, but it's basically a loaded, premium, non-performance pack S550 GT. And the first thing you notice, again, is night and day is the interior. I mean, first of all, you get an S550, it's wider, you have more room, it's more spacious. The dash layout is a lot nicer, it's a lot more modern, and you have a lot of different materials. You know what, when you get in the S197, it feels like everything you touch is that same textured plastic, and it's still here. I mean, the door panels are still the textured plastic, but the console is a softer feel. The dash is a softer feel. You have a different kind of material across the dash. They kind of just mix it up a little bit, so it doesn't feel like everything looks the exact same. Now, one of the big things in this particular car is going to be the gauge cluster. The stock cluster in the S197, it doesn't sit back quite back as far in the dash as the newer ones do, but the bigger difference with this car, this has the LCD cluster. So again, this is way more modern, way different than what you have from your S197 Mustang. If you have a base model GT, the cluster is kind of similar. It does sit back flusher. Again, you kind of have more room between yourself and the dash and the gauges. Everything just is more spread out in here. You have more room to kind of stretch out. The seats go back further. There's more leg room. Not that the S197 is bad, but you get to be about 6'5", 6'6", and S197 gets pretty tight where these cars have a ton of room in them. Ride-wise, the S550, it is a quieter car inside. Again, they've done different things with sound deadening. Even in 18 over the 15 through 17 cars, the 18 has a little bit better sound deadening in it, but you really notice it when you drive it. I mean, these cars are extremely quiet inside, and that IRS just soaks up the bumps. I mean, especially in corners, but even going in a straight line like we're doing here, you can just feel that the car, it's a different kind of feel. The suspension's more planted, and it just has almost inspires almost more confidence, especially if you hit a bump in corners. You know, you hit the wrong kind of bump with a solid axle car going through a corner, it can unsettle the rear. Now, obviously, there's aftermarket stuff that can help with that, but stock for stock, the ride quality IRS is just that much better. I mean, you really, really feel the difference. You know, does it make it a better car? No, because it depends what you're using it for. You take a stock S550 with the IRS to the drag strip, and you're probably gonna get a ton of wheel hop and have trouble putting the power down, where the stock suspension on a solid axle S197 car, you can go to the drag strip with a stock car, and suspension works pretty good, actually. So, you know, the S550, you know, the IRS as a whole, it's not night and day better, it's just different. So is it better? Again, that's up to the driver, what they're doing with the car. I mean, me, I like to do a lot of road trips with my cars. I love the independent rear suspension. I love the way it feels on the highway. I love the way it feels on the back roads. I love the way it performs. But again, if drag racing is your thing, well, it's definitely not, without some money spent, going to be equivalent to what the solid axle is going to do, especially stock for stock. Ride quality is just amazing on an S550. If you have an S197, you haven't driven one, even if you hate the way they look and hate everything about them, you know, take one for a ride just to get a feel for it. It is a different kind of car. You know, while the S197, I'm going to say, and you know, all your road racers don't hate me because I know you can make them great track cars, but the S197 is kind of the last of the muscle Mustangs where it was a great straight line car but could do everything else. Now the S550, it's kind of a do-it-all kind of car. So at the end of the day, which one's better? Well, again, that is an impossible question to answer. It's going to depend on you and what you want to do with the car. It's like when you come to the S550, it's like, yes, performance-wise, the nod's got to go here. But if you like that old school muscle car feel, you can't beat an S197. As far as modifications, there's tons of modifications available for both of them to build the car exactly the way you want it. So again, which one's better? Well, that's entirely up to you.